there are many, many Christian women out there that had a huge impact on Christianity, and I think it's important that their stories are shared as much as possible. And this first video is about Gladys Aylward, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. Apologize if I didn't get that quite right. But she was born in 1902 in Edmonton, North London, to a working class family. She left school at 14 and went to work as a housemaid, which was basically what poor girls did in early 20th century England. She had no formal education beyond basic schooling. She had no money or connections or any kind of qualifications. But in her late 20s, she became a Christian and felt called to missionary work in China, which was extremely difficult to do. She had no money for passage and no education, but she ended up applying to China Inland Mission anyway. And the China Inland Mission was one of the most significant missionary organizations at the time. It was founded by Hudson Taylor in 1865, and it was known for sending missionaries deep into China rather than just staying on the coastal cities. The mission had really high standards and a very difficult training session because they were sending people into dangerous situations. After a probationary period, the mission rejected Gladys. They decided she wasn't qualified. At 30 years old with very little education, they decided she would never be able to learn Chinese and wouldn't be able to survive the training, so they told her no. And most people probably would have accepted this. The experts had evaluated her and found her unsuitable, so it made sense, but Gladys was stubborn. So if the mission wouldn't send her, she would send herself. So she kept working as a housemaid and saving everything she earned. She contacted a 73-year-old missionary named Jeannie Lawson, who was already working over there. Mrs. Lawson wrote back saying if Gladys could get herself to China, she could work with her. So in 1930, Gladys bought a ticket on the Trans-Siberian Railway. She only had enough money for a one-way ticket, and she had no intention of coming back anyway. So she packed up, got some food, and set off across Europe and Russia and into China. She was 28 years old when she did this, and she was by herself and traveling through some of the most dangerous territories in the world during a time of political instability. And the journey nearly killed her. In Siberia, she found herself in the middle of a war zone between Russia and China, and she was detained, threatened, and had to flee. But she did manage to book a ship to Japan and then another to China. The whole trip took several weeks and involved several close calls with death. And when she finally reached Yancheng in 1932, she began working with Mrs. Lawson. And they came up with an idea that they would open an inn for mule drivers who passed through the mountains there. The problem was that no one wanted to stay in an inn run by foreign women, so Gladys would physically grab the lead mule of passing caravans and pull it to the courtyard. And then once the mule was in, the rest would follow and the drivers would have little choice but to stay. So it was like aggressive hospitality, I guess you could say, but it worked. And then every evening after the guests were fed, Gladys and Mrs. Lawson would tell them Bible stories. And the guests would then carry these stories to other villages and towns along their routes. It ended up being a pretty effective way of spreading the gospel in a region that had never heard it before. And then in 1933, Mrs. Lawson passed away, leaving Gladys by herself. But by that point, Gladys had learned Chinese, made connections in the community, and earned some respect. And then came the opportunity. The Chinese government was trying to end the ancient practice of foot binding, where young girls' feet were broken and bound to keep them small. It was a terrible practice, but it was deeply embodied in the culture. So the government needed someone to travel from village to village inspecting women's feet to ensure the practice had stopped. They asked Gladys to do it, and it was perfect for her. So she opposed foot binding on principle, so she could travel to villages throughout the region, and she could share the gospel while doing official government work. And she became a foot inspector, one of the strangest missionary roles in history, I think. But this also required her to become a Chinese citizen, which she did. And as Gladys traveled along, she began taking in orphans and abandoned children. Some were left on her doorstep, some she found while she was traveling, and some of the children had parents who had passed away. And her house became an orphanage, filled with these kids she really couldn't afford to feed, but couldn't really turn away either. She also fought against human trafficking, and when she found out that girls were being sold into slavery or prostitution, she intervened, and sometimes physically confronting the traffickers. So that was pretty fearless in a way. It made no practical sense, a small foreign woman challenging powerful local interests, but she did it anyway. The local community increasingly respected her. In 1937, Japan invaded China, and by 1940, the war had reached the Shaanxi province. Gladys ended up being injured in a bombing, taking shrapnel wounds, and it was becoming clear that staying there was impossible. So Gladys had nearly 100 orphans in her care, and she had to get them out of there, get them to a safe place. But the only safe place was the city of Xi'an, which was in free China. The problem with Xi'an was that it was over 100 miles away across mountains with Japanese patrols everywhere. So she decided to walk with nearly 100 children. The youngest was only 4 years old. And they had little food, no clear route, and again, the Japanese soldiers were all over the place out there. This journey took several weeks. They walked through mountains, forded rivers, hid from patrols, and scrounged for food. Eventually, Gladys's feet became infected and she developed typhus. Several times she almost died, but she kept the children going. Then they had to cross the Yellow River, but there were no boats and the river was way too deep for them to ford. So they just sat there and waited on the bank for days while Gladys prayed. And finally, a Chinese officer on the opposite bank saw them and got a boat to bring them across. And then they continued walking. And when Gladys became too sick to go on, the other children took turns carrying the younger ones and helped keep her moving. It took them nearly a month to get to Xi'an, and all 100 children survived. That's incredible, to lead 100 orphans across the wilderness like that, in the middle of a war, and for everybody to get there safely. That's incredible. That's a remarkable woman right there. There's no way I could have done it, and I bet most of us couldn't have done that. That took some serious faith and determination right there. She's an example that we should all follow as Christians, doing whatever it took to keep these kids safe. That's incredible. She continued working with orphans and refugees in China for several more years, but her health was declining, and in 1947 she was forced to return to England to recover. She eventually settled in Taiwan in 1957, where she continued working with orphans until her death in 1970. Her story ended up becoming famous in the West through a 1958 book called The Small Woman by Alan Burgess, and then through the 1958 film The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Gladys wasn't entirely happy with the film. It took liberties with the facts and added romantic subplots and things that never happened, but it did make her story known worldwide. So I think what stands out about Gladys is her stubbornness. She was told she wasn't qualified and she went anyway. When the journey was impossible, she still made it. When she was told to leave the orphans behind, she took them over the mountains. She had a pattern of hearing, "No, you can't," and responding with, "Yes, I can." Now, this wasn't reckless or anything like that. She was actually practical in many ways, but she had an unshakable conviction that God had called her to China, and she refused to let obstacles, whatever they were, whether it was mission boards or poverty or distance, war or injury or illness, get in her way. Her story challenges the idea that God only uses the qualified, or the ones with the credentials or the approval. Gladys had none of these things. She was a housemaid and very stubborn in her faith, and she ended up saving 100 children and bringing the gospel to thousands of people in one of the most remote regions of China at the time. So she's a great example for all of us as Christians, and I think her life raises some important questions like, how many people never do what they're called to do because someone else tells them they're not qualified? How many potential missionaries or ministers or servants of God accept expert opinions that they aren't good enough and never end up trying, or end up defeating themselves and never trying? So I think Gladys's life is a testament to the power of faith. When you're called to do something by God, you do it. Even if experts say you can't, or if you don't have the money, or if the journey seems impossible. You buy that train ticket, you make the journey, and you trust that God will meet you on the other side. So that's all I've got on Gladys today. There's a lot more information out there about her if you want to research it or check out the book or anything like that. And if you're someone struggling right now with this defeated mindset because somebody has discouraged you, or because you've defeated yourself because you think you don't have the talent or the skill or the resources to do what you're called to do, I've got a video about that. The link is on the screen, and I encourage you to check that one out. And thank you for listening today, and please like and subscribe if you like these kind of videos, and let's try to get the Word of God out to as many people as we can.